The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, end of the year encore interviews, the racist roots of denying felons the right to vote, everything Donald Trump gets wrong about walls, plus Robert Reich on the choice that has to be made between oligarchy and an America that works for everyone. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. The history of denying felons the right to vote is rooted in the history of African American voter suppression. And while restoring that right is gaining traction in the 2020 campaign, Tierra Bradford says many Democratic hopefuls still don't get the point. And we say hello to Tierra Bradford, a legal fellow with Common Cause, where she recently posted an article titled Felony Disenfranchisement, the Issue That Isn't Going Away. Tierra Bradford, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me and letting me talk about this issue on your podcast.
Absolutely. It's our pleasure to have you with us, and it's extremely important issue, of course. So why don't we start by having you remind us of the history and purpose of denying felons the right to vote?
So the history of this law is pretty straightforward. Felony disenfranchisement laws are rooted in racism. After the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, there was a lot of resistance towards the end of slavery, giving Black people citizenship, and giving Black people suffrage. And the resistance was physical and violent, of course, but it was also institutional, which I don't think a lot of people know. And so felony disenfranchisement laws worked similarly to like poll taxes and laws that required people to own property. These laws were designed to target newly freed Black people and just take away their voting rights. And so the way this would work is that states would adopt these disenfranchisement laws. They would try to guess around and figure out what crimes Black people were most likely to commit in their state. And then they would have those laws be the laws that would, once someone committed that crime, they would be disenfranchised over those laws. And of course, also during that time, Black people were being incarcerated at higher rates than white people already, even during the Reconstruction era. So, yeah, that's basically the history of these laws. And then mixed with the war on drugs, you can imagine just how the number of people who are disenfranchised continued to grow and grow.
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, yeah, a problem that started off as a significant problem and it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So exactly. What's the reach of these laws today? And as a two-parter, how many people are prevented from voting?
Yeah, so according to the Sentencing Project, which is a really good resource to learn about this information, 1 out of every 40 adults in the U.S. today is not allowed to vote because of their felony conviction. And for Black people, that's 1 out of every 13 people. And for non-Black people, that's 1 out of every 56 people are unable to vote. And so in total, as of 2016, about 6.1 million people are not able to vote because they have been disenfranchised. Now, there was the Fourth Amendment, the Amendment 4 ballot initiative that took place in Florida, and that was supposed to lower the number of people who are disenfranchised because Florida right now has like 1.6 million people who are disenfranchised because of their felony conviction. But because they still haven't decided how the law will apply or not, we're just sticking to the number 6.1 million people who are disenfranchised.
All of those numbers, each one of those statistics is they're just mind-boggling. So I guess it's probably an understatement to say that these laws still have a disproportionate impact on African American citizens.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the comparison, 1 out of every 13 people compared to 1 out of 56 non-Black people. And then when you also think about it on another level, you have these families and these communities who are majority Black, and you have people in the families who are unable to vote. And so if you're not able to vote, you're not taking your kids with you to the polls. You're not talking to your friends about voting. And so you have communities that are in this cycle of political inactivity because of these laws.
So at the individual level, among those things that you just mentioned, I mean, what other impacts of losing your right to vote?
I mean, it can, the truth is that when people go to prison, when they go to jail, majority of them are released. And so when you come out of prison and you aren't able to vote and the various other rights that you don't have because you have a felony conviction, it can make it hard to just get on with your life and rehabilitate. It can make it difficult to rejoin your community. And that's why lots of research today supports voting rights for people who are currently and formerly incarcerated, because it lowers recidivism. Because once you become re-engaged in your community and re-engaged politically, you don't want to mess with your voting rights, and you don't want that taken away from you because you have a purpose and your voice has meaning.
Even though you have served your time, that you have paid your penalty back to society, basically. I mean, that's the other thing that nobody seems to talk about. It's like, wait a minute, I went to jail. I'm sorry for what I did. You should have rights reinstated. Right.
Like I believe in the organization I'm with believes that the voting rights should be separate from the criminal justice system. I'm not really sure why we continue to tie these two things together, because regardless of people's backgrounds and what they've done, they're like you said, they're paying back their debt to society, and voting is a fundamental right, and that those two things should just be kept separate.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Tierra Bradford. She's a legal fellow with Common Cause, where she recently posted an article titled Felony Disenfranchisement, the Issue That Isn't Going Away. Tierra, in your piece posted on that Common Cause website, you note that while several Democratic candidates are talking about felony disenfranchisement, the conversation is only at the surface level. You suggest that it would be better if all the candidates really took the time to study the issue and the impact that it has on our society. What are they missing?
I noticed that the voting rights issue has shifted to whether or not the Boston Marathon bomber can vote or not. And we're focusing on these like super specific crimes. And while I understand why people are upset by that, I just think the fear is misplaced. I think just framing the conversation in this way negates the reality of how fundamental voting is to our democracy, and it negates how biased and broken our criminal justice system is. I mean, we have people who are exonerated every day. Like, there are people in prison right now who haven't done anything, and we continue to deny them rights, like in and outside of the criminal justice system. And so basically what I was saying is that the candidates should take the time to learn about the history of these laws, to learn the disparate impact, and how voting rights could actually help with rehabilitation and help with public safety. Because right now, denying people voting rights it's hurting. It's not helping people get back into our society and lowering recidivism. So that's basically what I meant.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And presidential candidate Bernie Sanders made headlines when he suggested that felons should be able to vote even while they're still incarcerated, as opposed to after they've served their time. It's not clear yet that any other candidates would go that far. What's the argument that supports Bernie Sanders' position?
I think everything we've talked about so far, I think if, again, looking at the history and how these laws are antiquated and racist supports Bernie Sanders' position. I think looking at the disparate impact of these laws supports his position. I think the fact that voting rights could actually help lower recidivism and don't help with public safety supports his position. And also, I would like to point out that we already allow people to vote who are incarcerated in Maine and Vermont and in Puerto Rico. And so there are places in the U.S. that are allowing people to vote while they're in prison, and they're doing fine. And also other countries like Germany and other European countries aren't disenfranchising people. They aren't making, when they're currently incarcerated, when they're in prison, they aren't disenfranchising people. And if they are, it's for very specific, like, election crimes or democracy crimes. Mm-hmm. And so I think what supports Bernie Sanders' position is that there's really no point in having these laws, and they're hurting more than they're helping.
Yeah. Now, as you look across the nation, where are you seeing progress on restoring the right to vote for convicted felons? And are you hopeful this movement will keep growing?
Yeah, so part of my job at Common Cause is to try to track the legislative sessions in the different states. And honestly, it's been difficult to track voting rights restoration legislation because so many states have introduced bills this year trying to give back voting rights to people on varying levels who have been convicted of felony. And so you have states that are introducing legislation. You have states like New York, where their governor is pardoning people and restoring voting rights to people in large numbers. On the federal level, the Democracy Restoration Act was just introduced recently, and that act would basically give voting rights back to people in federal elections. So basically what I'm trying to say is there's a lot of movement happening right now. There's a lot of momentum. And even though people are fighting for voting rights restoration on different levels, I think what's important is that we're having these conversations. And I believe that even though the fight is going to be long and hard, I think that at one point we're going to get to where we aren't disenfranchising people over felony convictions anymore. Even though that'll be several years from now, I think we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, at least the ball is rolling. I mean,
exactly.
As opposed to it just sitting still. Sure. Tierra Bradford, a legal fellow with Common Cause, where she recently posted the article that we've been discussing, felony disenfranchisement, the issue that isn't going away, but hopefully that won't last for too much longer. Tierra, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to have you back again with us soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me and talking about this.
You're quite welcome, and we wish you the best of luck in your endeavors. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, history's verdict on using walls to solve border problems. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's number one populist, for his common sense commentary.
You probably haven't heard about it, but there's another mass migration coming across the U.S.-Mexico border. However, these are not Central American families fleeing horrific conditions back home, only to be separated, incarcerated, traumatized, and demonized by the Trump gang for seeking humanitarian asylum in our country. Rather, these migrants are going the other way, from the USA into Mexican border towns, where they're welcomed with open arms instead of armed guards. They're mostly working-class people seeking relief from our nation's unaffordable, no-care health care system. As many as 6,000 a day travel to towns like Los Algodones, across from Yuma, Arizona, to get medical services and prescription drugs that are priced out of their reach here in the U.S. Nicknamed Molar City, Los Algodones has more dentists per capita than anywhere else in the world. Quality dental work in Mexico averages 2/3 less than it costs here. This is because the health system there prioritizes care over profits. Start with professional education, which is tuition-free in Mexico, meaning dentists and other health care providers don't have to jack up prices to cover a crushing load of student debt. Also, Mexico's universal tax-paid health care system doesn't saddle patients with exorbitantly expensive insurance bureaucracies. It's a system that's open, affordable, and accessible to all, the opposite of ours, which is why hordes of U.S. working-class people go south to find care. As a Truth Out article reports, U.S. citizens seeking health care can park in Yuma for $5, walk across the border, get the help they need, and come back for dinner. This is Jim Hightower saying, instead of building a senseless border wall to keep people out of the U.S., our leaders ought to be looking across the border for ideas on how to build a better health care system.
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. President Trump often cites the Great Wall of China as evidence that a wall will solve our immigration problems. Adam Smith says it's a claim that history simply cannot support. And we say hello to Adam Smith, professor of anthropology at Cornell University, where he studies the relationship of the physical worlds we build to our political lives and values. Adam Smith, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
My pleasure to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You wrote a piece for the Washington Post a few years back that has been getting renewed attention. It was titled, "For 5 Millennia, Politicians Have Proposed Walls Like Trump's. They Don't Work." So with such a bad track record, what drives leaders to construct walls?
Well, I think it's because walls are a remarkably, deceptively perfect, simple solution. They appear to be a straightforward piece of architecture, but in fact, they're really complex technologies. And it's that dislocation between the image of them as simple and how they actually work that is part of their attraction. And I think one of the things we need to constantly keep in mind, as with any technology, we need to ask not just do they work, but rather ask work for what and for whom. I mean, we can, like archaeologists often do, we can look at other kinds of technologies as parallels and see if we can find the answers to that question. So oftentimes people will ask about the wheel, for example, another piece of technology, and the wheel works really well if you want to get from, say, New York to Washington, D.C. or something like that. But, of course, if A and B, or if your places are separated by an ocean, if New York to Paris is where you want to go, wheels don't work at all. So the question is, you always have to keep in mind, is work for what? I think we also have to keep in mind the question of, are there other technologies available that might work better? So archaeologists often study things like stone tools, for example, which were remarkably able during the Neolithic to clear huge forests, making way for some of humanity's earliest farmers. But if you really wanted to make a farm today, yes, a stone tool would work. So, but is there something else that would work that would be less laborious and less expensive and perhaps less time-consuming as well? So I think to simply say, do walls work, or as President Trump often likes to say, walls work, is really a deceptively simplistic way of looking at what is actually a complex technology.
Mm-hmm. Now, Adam, the president often cites the Great Wall of China as an example of success. What is he missing?
Well, I think what he's missing is that the Great Wall of China is actually not one wall, first of all. It's actually many different kinds of linear barriers that were set up over the course of over 300 years. And so what he's missing is that these are actually a broad system of sets of relationships between what's inside and outside that was in development for hundreds of years. And I think what he's also missing is that walls, or better he said, linear barriers, because that's what he's really talking about, are not only about blocking transportation. It's also about funneling. And linear barriers tend to work much better at funneling traffic than they do at completely forbidding connectivity. So whether it's Hadrian's Wall or the Great Wall of China, those walls tended to work really well as pushing peoples together at specific gate points. So the whole idea of many of these walls was to actually create specific gateways where then there would be interaction across these gateways, which was particularly ideal for the state or government because then you can tax them. Whereas if the interactions are spread out across villages across thousands of miles, taxation is much more difficult. So a linear barrier can work really well for regulating interconnections, particularly for the purposes of taxation. What it doesn't work for is long-term forestalling of large-scale migrations. And that's what Trump is missing about the Great Wall of China.
We're speaking with Adam Smith, professor of anthropology at Cornell University, where he studies the relationship of the physical worlds we build to our political lives and values. And Adam, if walls do not succeed in their stated goals, such as limiting migration, they do live on as political symbols. And you cite the Berlin Wall as an example. What's the symbolism of that wall?
Well, the symbolism for people in the U.S. for a generation was that the Berlin Wall was a means of trapping the citizens of what was then the Warsaw Pact behind a system of repression. And so walls really got that sense that they were walls of imprisonment rather than walls of protection. I think that that's a key element of the way in which the debate over walls is going on now, and that the lingering significance of the Berlin Wall as a means of trapping citizens rather than of protecting them is really something that we're still working through today. And it's clear that the president doesn't really quite understand the symbolism behind the wall as both something that can forestall migration across it, but also feels like it's cutting off interaction and imprisoning the people within it.
And isolating us in the meantime from the rest of the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Both symbolically as a nation that is fearful and resentful of the world, and also physically in terms of trade and interaction.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you listen to the president talk about the wall he wants to build on our southern border, what's the symbolism and meaning you hear him speaking to?
Well, I think it's actually a relatively old sense of fear that we mostly hear. And you often hear him bring up the parallel between, say, your fence around your house or the wall around a city as parallel to the kinds of linear barrier he has in mind across something like 2,000 miles of the U.S.-Mexico border. But those are actually drawn out of very different kinds of symbolic systems. So the fence around your house is obviously not intended as a guard against massive migrations of your neighbors into your yard. It's a completely different kind of symbolic system that's more about home and the continuity of property. The city wall is much more emblematic symbolically in history of the kind of independence of a city. In ancient Mesopotamia, when a city would build a wall, it was a very clear demonstration of their own sovereignty. And then concomitantly, when a city was conquered, one of the first things that the conquering force would do would be to knock down some city walls to show your subservience. There, the city wall was really symbolic of one's independence rather than it was functional in a military sense, and particularly in ancient Mesopotamia at least. When we're talking about long linear barriers that stretch off way into places that are largely uninhabited, you really lose a lot of that symbolic potency, because most of the time they're not encountered and most people don't even know they're there. I think it wouldn't be untrue to suggest that many Americans don't know exactly what the wall that's already along portions of the southern border actually looks like. So I think one of the difficulties of thinking about the symbolism of a long linear barrier is that so much of what's planned would be really invisible to most citizens.
Mm-hmm. What are the unintended consequences of wall building that you would want to warn us about?
Well, there are probably many unintended consequences. I mean, one of them is that walls tend to move population movements into different places. They don't block them, they just move them. And so a lot of the walls that have been built along the U.S.-Mexico border, like walls that were built in ancient Mesopotamia as well, have not stopped movement. They've merely put it in different places. And so a number of anthropologists have pointed out the humanitarian crisis that occurred when a number of walls were built that merely forced migrants out into harsher conditions of the deserts of the U.S. Southwest. This was, of course, what I would think of as an unintended consequence, where a goal of forestalling migration actually merely had the impact of making it far, far more dangerous and costing more in human life. So that's one of the major impacts. The other is that walls have a long set of obligations that they entail. So it's not enough just to say, well, I want $5 billion or more likely $25 billion to build a wall. You then have to keep them up. And one of the lessons of, for example, the Great Wall of China is that it's extremely expensive to keep and maintain walls, that they are in constant need of repair, in constant need of provisioning, in constant need of manning. And as such, you also tend to make your responses to any kinds of activities at the border become more rigid and less supple. So you build, say, guard stations along the border. Now you've got places that need to be manned, need to be occupied, and you create a much less mobile force that's actually supervising movement across that border. All of these are the kinds of unintended consequences that are entailed because the wall creates certain possibilities for policing while getting rid of others.
Well, I have a feeling this is not the last time we're going to have a conversation about a wall, and we would love to have you back and join us to talk more about it. Adam Smith, professor of anthropology at Cornell University, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Adam, thank you so much for your time. We do look forward to having you back again with us soon.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you. You as well. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Robert Reich is one of our nation's leading economists. He says the widening gap between the wealthy and everyone else is the defining issue of our time, and that's why Democrats have to choose a side. And we say hello to Robert Reich, an American economist, professor, author, and political commentator. Our listeners will certainly remember he served as Secretary of Labor from 1993 to 1997 and was a member of President Barack Obama's Economic Transition Advisory Board. Professor Robert Reich, thank you very much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. You recently wrote an article for the American Prospect titled, Why 2020 Won't Be Won by Centrists. Now, in that article, you quickly demolished some key talking points that we're hearing about during this election period. One is that electability matters. What's wrong with that statement?
Well, electability obviously matters, but the question is whether you get electability by being a centrist. or whether you get electability by actually getting turnout. And they're not exactly the same thing. I mean, a lot of people these days are excited by politics not because of centrism, but because they are motivated by new ideas, or they are angry about how things are, or they are indignant. I mean, most of the energy in the Democratic Party is with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Let's face it. And they are not exactly your old establishment centrists. But to be an establishment centrist is not to be somebody who's going to get out the vote.
Well, and another idea you take on is that for Democrats, this race is a contest between moderates and the left. And I think a lot of people would say, well, what's wrong with that?
And the problem there, Jim, is that the old left-right continuum that American politics used to be based on, where people on the left said, well, we want more government, we want more public investment, stronger safety nets, and so forth, and people on the right said, we want more free market. Well, that old left-right debate, although still relevant, is far less relevant in the age of Trump and the age of kind of super-rich oligarchs whose wealth and power are basically taking over America. The issue today and the divide today is less between the old left and right than it is between democracy and oligarchy. And I think if people understood that better, and they understood the actual power dynamics that are affecting America, a lot of people who are working class and middle class who consider themselves on the right, kind of old conservatives, would join with progressives and help create a really a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class movement against the intrusions of the oligarchy on American democracy, the attempts by the oligarchy, and I mean the very, very, very wealthy who are in effect behind Trump. Trump has given them everything they want. Trump is a Trojan horse for the oligarchy. The rest of us really do need to understand that is the dynamic that's going on today.
Well, and as you point out, this state of oligarchy is at the expense of many who voted for Donald Trump, and many will vote for him again, I would guess. What are they failing to see, and why? Because I think for a lot of us, it's pretty plain and simple, but somehow or another, he's able to bring these people and keep these people in.
I think a lot of these people are very, very angry, and they continue to be angry about a system. And I'm not just talking about politics. I'm talking about the political economic system that seems to be rigged against them. Their wages have not increased at all over the last 40 years. Even in this so-called good economy, the wage increases are barely recognizable in terms of the median wage. It's up about 1.2% over the past year, adjusted for inflation. That's nothing. The CEO, the typical CEO, increased his or her income, just income, not capital gains, just income over the last year by $500,000. But a lot of these people also are facing less and less job security. And they say, well, what is it that the Democrats under Bill Clinton, my administration, very proud of that administration, but still under Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, what is it that the Democrats really did for us? A lot of these people say, and I know because I've talked to them, we want to continue to shake up this country. We don't trust the economic elites. Now, please note, Jim, that this is not that different from the themes that Bernie Sanders raised in 2016 and now both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are raising. And that's my point, really, that there are a lot of Trump supporters who could, I think, be persuaded to join Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren because, after all, the fundamental reality is that most of America has been shafted over the last 4 decades. The very wealthy are getting wealthier and wealthier. Most of America's wealth is now concentrated in ways that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age of the 1890s. Once again, we see it now. And that wealth is compounding at a remarkable rate, which means that the power is also compounding at the top. A lot of people who are Trump supporters feel that this is the way to shake things up. Trump is their vehicle for expressing their anger and frustration. Well, I understand that, and I sympathize with it, but I think that they need to open their eyes to the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are also, and they have specific ideas, unlike Donald Trump, who just wants to give tax breaks for the very rich and regulatory rollbacks for the very rich and big corporations. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren actually have very specific ideas that will help poor and working class and middle class Americans.
Well, and you know, this great divide between the top and the rest of us, even just in the last 3 years, nobody's seeing their wages go up that significantly, especially a lot of these folks that voted for Donald Trump. Is it your sense that Americans want to take on that real divide between the rich and powerful and the rest of us?
Yes, I think that's exactly right, Jim. That was not the case, let's say, up until the financial crisis. Before the financial crisis, most Americans, most Poles, most of the people I met when I was labor secretary, they didn't want, for example, to tax the rich because they said to themselves, well, one day I'm going to be rich or my children are going to be rich. The American dream was quite palpable in those days. But after the financial crisis, I think on the right and the left, the old right, the old left, the Tea Partiers and the brief Occupy movement, both began to see things differently, and it began to affect how the rest of America saw things. And that change was that the game is rigged in favor of the rich and powerful. I'm not going to be rich. My children are not going to be rich. I don't mind taxing the billionaires or the $50 million assets that are aggregated to the top, because that's the only way we're going to be able to do things that I need and my children need, like better schools, better infrastructure.
We're speaking with Professor Robert Reich, of course, Secretary of Labor from 1993 to 1997, of course, a member of President Barack Obama's Economic Transition Advisory Board as well. And taking this into the world of political campaigns, what's the message that Democrats should be leading with that can win not only the White House, but state and local races as well?
I think Democrats' overall message, and we can talk about sub-messages and pieces of the message, but the overall message has to be that Democrats represent the people against the powerful. This has been, and it was the Democratic message in the 1930s. It was the Franklin D. Roosevelt coalition. It has been, from time to time, a critical part of the Democratic message, but it was lost in the 1980s, 1990s. Democrats began representing soccer moms and swing voters and suburban swing voters, and they lost the working class, not just the white working class, but Democrats began to lose the working class. And I think it's critically important that Democrats begin to say once again what they used to say and what they represented, and that is the people against the powerful and the privileged.
Now, in terms of a policy platform, what do you hope to see as we get closer to 2020?
Well, the policies are not that complicated. Everybody knows that health insurance expenses are completely out of control. We can debate the different Democratic policy views, but there's no question that Republicans have no ideas at all. In fact, Republicans want to repeal, are trying to repeal, are actively seeking in court to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which most people depend on. Republicans also have turned their backs on Medicaid and Medicaid expansion as part of the Affordable Care Act. So we can, one thing that worries me is Democrats start criticizing each other, Democratic candidates, as to whether they have exactly the right plan, or if their plan actually, if the dollars add up exactly right. Well, we're facing a bunch of Republicans who couldn't give a damn about Medicare or Medicaid or health care for average people or working class people. And Democrats really have got to get together on this. I hope that we don't face a primary season where they're kind of carping about each other's healthcare plans. Another major area, obviously, is education and affording education, making education affordable, making primary and secondary education excellent for all people. I mean, if we're segregating more and more by income, according to where we live, and that is actually what we are doing, then the local property tax cannot be as large a source of revenue for our local schools, because to do so is a recipe for widening inequality of educational opportunity, and that's what we're seeing. And that's why the working class, lower middle class, and the poor, many of those kids have really start out with poor schools. How can they get ahead on the basis of that kind of education? And they can't afford, if they do get to the point of going to college, they can't afford to go to college, many of them. So that the idea that Bernie Sanders came up with in 2016, free public higher education, I think, is critically important. To finance a lot of this, a wealth tax is necessary. Anybody who says it's not necessary doesn't look at what has happened to the wealth in this country as it has concentrated and accumulated at the top. Most other people don't have wealth. The top 0.1% of Americans, the richest 0.1%, we're talking about something in the order of 120,000 families, have more wealth than the bottom 90% of American families put together. We have not seen this since the 1880s, 1890s, since the great sort of period of time. And it wasn't really a great period of time. We called it then the Gilded Age. But we're back there now. And this is a dangerous place to be, because it means that you're feeding not only a great deal of resentment that comes in the form of either Trumpism or racism, and Trumpism and racism are very closely aligned, xenophobia, another form of Trumpism, but you're also feeding a sense of cynicism about the entire system. A lot of people today, they look at that accumulated wealth at the top and they say, they are rigging the system in ways that make it impossible for me ever to get ahead. And the big danger there, obviously, is that people drop out of politics. They say, what's the point of even being a political activist if the game is so rigged? That's one of my worries. Another thing I think that Democrats have got to begin to push on very, very clearly and actively is the notion that a kind of basic minimum income, a kind of a universal basic income is necessary. It's coming inevitably. As new technologies take over many of the jobs that had been the middle-class jobs a generation ago, there is of necessity going to be a kind of minimum basic income, a wage that is not necessarily a good wage. In fact, it's certainly not going to be a good wage, but it's going to be a subsistence wage for people so that they still have a motivation to get a job, but they don't have to worry that if they can't get a job or if they lose a job and are between jobs, they and their family will be in jeopardy.
Well, and finally, Professor, if Democrats fail to accept the challenge and go with a centrist, what could be the impact there? Well,
the impact in the most kind of obvious way is that Donald Trump could be reelected. Because, again, the powerful and most powerful force in both parties is anti-establishment. And the reason for that powerful force, the reason anti-establishment forces are so powerful in both parties, is that the establishment has failed the rest of the country. The Democratic establishment as well as the Republican establishment, both establishments, they're different, of course. I don't want to engage in a kind of false equivalency. Democrats and the Democratic establishment much more sensitive to the problems of poverty, much more sensitive to issues of identity politics and marriage equality and the environment. But when it comes to wealth and power and the very dangerous interaction between wealth and power. The Democratic establishment is not that different from the Republican establishment. They've sat by over the last 40 years and allowed wages to stagnate for most Americans and wealth and power to concentrate at the top, taking over our democracy, taking over our politics. I think that the danger is that either Americans become cynical and allow the oligarchy to take over completely, of which re-election of Donald Trump would just be one aspect of that terror. But it's also deeper than that. It means that we lose the American dream altogether. We lose the essential optimism that characterized and has characterized America. We lose the resilience that we have always had. I think that the danger of just going with the establishment when the establishment has been so irresponsible for so many years is that we end up losing an aspect of our soul, the American soul.
I think for anyone that's concerned about going too far to the left, being too progressive, all they really need to do is look at a paycheck stub. And that should probably answer the question for them. Well,
that's when I tell people to talk with people who disagree with them. When I tell progressives, for example, to go out and talk to conservatives, talk to your relatives who disagree with you. Many people are reluctant to do that because they get into terrible arguments and they don't think they're making any progress. But I think that you're onto something. I think the way to begin those kinds of hard conversations is not with Trump, and it's not with large ideology or left or right or communism or socialism or capitalism. No, you start from the paycheck, the pay stub. You say to your relative, your conservative Trump-supporting relative in Ohio, you say, well, how are you doing? I mean, how's the job? And over Thanksgiving table, you say, well, how, are you just candidly? Are you making it? Or how do you feel about your kids' opportunities? And you talk about your own pay stub and your own economic reality. And on that basis, you find a commonality. You build on the common economic and ultimately common social and eventually common political frameworks that people actually have. As I get out into the country and I do a lot of traveling, I try to get out of the bubble of Berkeley, California, I go to visit states that I visited when I was Secretary of Labor. I talk to people who I talked with or their families that I got to know when I was Secretary of Labor in Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan, North Carolina, in Missouri. These families, these people, their children, many of them are Trump supporters, but they're not Republicans in some deep, passionate ideological way. They're certainly not racists. Many of them, as I've already expressed, they are just so fed up with the system we have. They're so fed up with not being able to get ahead, with this mounting sense that the system really is rigged against them by the rich, by the powerful, by the wealthy. And it's important to have these conversations that start with paychecks, that start with the kitchen table economics that everybody has to face every day, every week, with paying the bills every month.
Amen. Professor Robert Reich, former Secretary of Labor from 93 to 97, member of President Barack Obama's Economic Transition Advisory Board, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Professor, thank you very much for your time with us. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Well, thank you, Jim.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Tierra Bradford, Adam Smith, and Robert Reich. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.